We're going to do it a little bit different because we've got two basic, another facet of what we were talking about in terms of phase 4 is going to be voting. And we're seeing a perfect example of the crap show. It is unimaginable what is taking place over the past, I guess, I don't know how many hours that is, 72 hours. The long and short of it is that Evers, the governor of Wisconsin, was a little bit late and a little bit timid in pressing the Republican legislature in Wisconsin. Now, there are a couple of things you have to remember. The Democrats got over 50% of the votes in the last election in Wisconsin for state representatives. 50% of the votes across the board. 50, I think it's 52 or 54 or 51. Because of gerrymandering, Republicans won 64% of the seats that make up the state legislature. When there is an attempt to push back and say, hey, this is not the way that democracy works. If you get more than 50% of the votes, you should have at least close to 50% of the elected representatives. We're going to take this to the state Supreme Court. But the state Supreme Court is dominated by conservatives, and they say the gerrymander is fine. So it was 54% of voters chose a Democratic candidate for the state assembly. Republicans have, they now have 63 of the state's 99 assembly seats. That's messed up. They keep that gerrymander in. They pass laws like they did on Friday of last week saying we're not going to postpone the primary because there is a re-election of, or I should say a new election for a new state Supreme Court justice. And they had seen that absentee ballots coming in from Waukesha County were outpacing Milwaukee County significantly. So they said, we've got the votes. You got to have the vote on Tuesday of this week. And we're going to appeal the decision that said that you could extend the absentee ballots to the 13th because people didn't know that they needed to get them because they didn't realize it was going to be so difficult to vote because of coronavirus. The U.S. Supreme Court just basically said, nope, they've got to be in by today. And if they're not, the vote doesn't count. Meanwhile, there are five polling places in Milwaukee when usually there are, I think, like 500. We can ask, maybe there's 70. I don't know. I can tell you it's a fraction. We'll ask John Nichols, who's on the ground in Wisconsin. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program the national affairs correspondent for The Nation magazine and the host of the podcast Next Left for The Nation magazine, John Nichols. John, welcome back to the program.
It's an honor to be with you, my friend.
You've got a new cover story for The Nation magazine called How to Win in Wisconsin. That is obviously about the general election. But there's also, there's an election today. One of those things being, it's obviously a Democratic primary, but it's also an election for the state Supreme Court. Back up and walk us through how in the world there is a primary election today in Wisconsin when we have seen the data as to how Michigan having their primary may have increased the infection rate of coronavirus. I mean, what we've seen in the past, like 48 hours, has been every single problem with the courts and their involvement in our election process that one could imagine, it seems.
You are correct, my friend. Wisconsin, my home state, my family's home state for 6 generations, historically had two things that were really great about it. Terrific elections and, frankly, a really strong commitment to public health. It was a state that in the influenza epidemic of 1918 did dramatically better than the rest of the country because it was about the only place that actually locked down. And so Wisconsin has all these great traditions. Unfortunately, they have intersected with the horrible politics of our times. So on this day, April 7th, Wisconsin had a scheduled election. A lot of people nationally are focusing on the presidential primary, the Democratic primary especially, and also to some extent on the state Supreme Court race. It's important to understand that this is also a day when literally hundreds of local offices, city council, county board, mayors, village presidents are elected, including the mayor of Milwaukee is up for election, the county executive of Milwaukee County, our largest city, largest county. So it's actually a very big election day. And the interesting thing is that there's a lot at stake for conservatives and for progressives. It's very typical in this deeply divided state. But here's where things really came apart. Every state that had an election scheduled in this period, as this pandemic has risen to a level that it's the focus of everything going on in the country, as well as the economic downturn. Every state that in this period right now had a primary has moved it. They have generally moved it to early June. In Wisconsin, because we have divided government, a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, was much more difficult to do that. The governor tried to work with the legislature repeatedly. He called them into special session. He did negotiations, everything to try to delay this election, to postpone it. The Republicans refused. So finally, yesterday afternoon, Governor Tony Evers announced in the early afternoon that he was postponing in-person voting because public health people had said he should do it. Civil rights and voting rights groups had said he should do it. The mayors of all of our major cities said he should do it. I mean, it was just, there was this overwhelming call to postpone in a graceful way. What he said was, absentee ballots that have already been cast will be counted. People can continue casting absentee ballots into June. And then in early June, if indeed we've passed through the worst of this pandemic, we may also have in-person voting. But he canceled the in-person voting for today. Republicans in the legislature immediately objected. They had mocked him. They had ridiculed him. They had attacked him. They had refused to cooperate with him on this. And then they attacked him for taking action. They sued in the state Supreme Court, and within hours got a state Supreme Court from a majority on that court that is closely aligned with the Republicans in the legislature, blocking what the governor had done. And then the U.S. Supreme Court, responding to another conservative lawsuit, upended absentee voting. And so we have this horrible situation today where across Wisconsin, tens of thousands of people are lining up to go to polling places. And they're doing so at a point where we believe the majority of poll workers are not going to be working, where cities across the state have had to dramatically reduce their number of polling places. In Milwaukee, for instance, they have 180 polling places. Their system was set up because that was the number that was needed for a city of that size. They now have 5. And the lines to vote in those 5 polling places go around blocks, down streets, through parking lots. It is a nightmare scenario where the county executive of Milwaukee County says the coronavirus will be spread further because of the decisions made by the courts and these Republican politicians, and where the county executive says more people will die.
There's so much to be just completely both enraged and just and shocked by. I mean, the idea that the United States Supreme Court would look at this and not even consider, would narrowly tailor their question in such a way so as to completely disenfranchise. I mean, you're disenfranchising people in about 6 different ways in this instance. I exaggerated the number of polls in Milwaukee, but I mean, people should just contemplate for a moment. 180 down to 5. I mean, there's no physical way for those 5 polling places to even provide a fraction of the opportunity to vote that 180 would. I mean, I guess technically a fraction, but it is like, it is what? It's
a small fraction.
2%, right? I mean, that's basically what it is.
And let me give you another example, my friend. just to say that this is statewide. It's not just in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is where we've had the highest level of coronavirus cases, where we have had the highest level of deaths, and so it's a particular concern for a whole bunch of reasons. But in Waukesha, a community with a substantial Latino population, they had dozens of polling places. They're down to one. In communities across the state where you had many, many polling places, they're down to one or two. And there was a report late last week that as many as 100 jurisdictions simply did not have poll workers. And they just didn't have people to do it.
And is my understanding correct that the Republican-controlled legislature is aware that there has been more absentee ballots coming in from Waukesha, which is traditionally, those absentee ballots come in from Waukesha, that is traditionally Republican voters. Is that right?
I think that they, in anticipation of this moment, there's no question that they ramped up their advocacy for absentee voting in the last week or so as this issue heightened. Now, it's true that also there's a large level of absentee voting in much of the state because people were scared, and a lot of people put in applications. But here's where things really get. Sam,
I'm sorry, we lost you for a second.
You're right that in some places, what's that?
We lost you for 1 second.
Oh, I was going to say, here's where things get incredibly messy. There was in some places you had early messages to get your absentee ballot, do it, take care of it. But there's a lot of the state where people traditionally vote in person. It's just how it's been for a very long time. And I'm one of those people who historically has voted in person. And as this crisis came, you had a late surge of people asking for absentee ballots, particularly from Milwaukee County and from Racine, from Beloit, places with large African-American and Latino populations, and a lot of large working class populations. People saying, oh, I better not do what I usually do, which is to vote in person, but to get an absentee ballot. It was such a crushing, overwhelming demand from these places that clerks were working in some cases as many as 110 hours a week to get the ballots turned around. A federal judge last Friday said, this is too overwhelming. While he did not postpone the election, he did extend the amount of time when you could apply for an absentee ballot. And then he extended the amount of time in which you could get it through the mail, fill it out, get it back, and have it processed. And so basically he gave another week into early next week to kind of make this whole process work. It was a practical decision that simply extended the absentee balloting. And the Supreme Court yesterday, the U.S. Supreme Court, shut that down.
That's what's so
as of this afternoon.
That's what's so amazing about that ruling. They knew that people were operating under the understanding that they had a couple of extra days to get that ballot in, and without any warning, basically said wrong, no, end of story. I mean, that's what's so. That's one of the things that's so shocking about this. Let me ask you this, John. Why couldn't in Ohio, DeWine did not cancel the election? What he did was he said the election can take place, but the Board of Health or the state's health department said stay at home order. You can't go out. So the election will take place, but you can't do it. Why didn't they do that in Wisconsin?
They did. Essentially, what Tony Evers announced yesterday afternoon, Monday afternoon, at around 1:00, was essentially what DeWine had done. He said we can't do now. He took the responsibility on himself personally. DeWine had his health secretary step up and do it, but the health secretary for Wisconsin, administrator, was right there with Evers, and so it's the same as Ohio. What Evers said was, we can't do in-person voting, and so we're just going to extend the election. We're gonna open things up so that we can have absentee voting for a longer period. We can get through this confusing moment, and we'll make it all work. The parallels to what DeWine did in Ohio are pretty amazing. It's very, very similar, except for one difference. in Ohio, DeWine was a Republican governor with a Republican legislature and, frankly, a sympathetic state Supreme Court. In Wisconsin, Evers is a Democratic governor with a incredibly belligerent Republican legislative leadership. They have tried to undermine him at every point, and a Supreme Court that is aligned with that leadership. And so what you need to understand, this is an important thing, is this isn't simply Republican or Democrat, because DeWine's a Republican. Many Republican governors have delayed elections. This isn't conservative or liberal, because there have been conservatives who've delayed elections. This is win at any cost, spiteful, abusive hackery on the part of Republicans who think that if they game this process, if they narrow this process, maybe they Supreme Court. I wish I could see some lighter way of referring to it, but I can't see anything. I cannot see any redemptive choice that was made here. I think it was made entirely to thwart the governor's efforts to have a safe and fair election.
You know, the next question I was going to ask you was, how will Wisconsin respond to this? Because, you know, I remember I was out there for the protests against Scott Walker when he was cutting things like Badger Care and making Wisconsin a right to work state. And then I remember when the recall of Walker failed because people just didn't like the idea of the recall. They found it sort of impolite on some level. And I was going to ask, like, how are Wisconsin voters responding to the idea that all these people are going to be, that it's going to spread the coronavirus, or has a chance to, or it's at the very least risking it? And then it occurs to me, it's like, they've already got this that rigged. I mean, if they get the Supreme Court, if they get one more seat on the Supreme Court, they've already got the place jerry rigged. You need at least, 54% of the vote only gets you, 60 gets you only, whatever it is, 42 elected representatives. You'd have to get 70% of the vote to win the state house, and they just have locked it in some way, and they just don't care, do they?
I think you're speaking to a lot of the reality. Let's first off make it clear. We know how Wisconsin thinks about delaying the election. There was a terrific poll done by our top polling group, the Marquette University Law School poll last week, in which an overwhelming majority of Wisconsinites said postpone the election. Move it. They basically said do exactly what Evers did yesterday. So by a 54 to 42 margin, and that was even before things had reached their peak or started to move toward their peak. They said delay. So the people of Wisconsin wanted this delay. The mayors of our major cities said delay this. There's no doubt where sentiment is. But you are right, Sam. You were talking about, frankly, a gerrymandering of the legislature and a host of other interventions, including a lot of big money from the Koch brothers and others, that has sought to make Wisconsin a historic swing state into a Republican state. Now, here's the interesting thing. In 2018, they had everything in play to reelect Scott Walker. Statewide,
no, we lost you.
And so, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
In 2018, I don't know, where'd you lose me in that?
Just they had everything in play to reelect Scott Walker.
They had everything in play to reelect Scott Walker, and yet Democrats won every single statewide race. They won for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, state treasurer, and U.S. Senate. And so we know that the people of Wisconsin, at least we have good evidence. The question is how much they will lean and how much they may be influenced by what has happened. Clearly, the Republicans have done everything they can to gerrymander, to jerry-rig the elections of this state. But what they have done this week, in fact, this last 24 hours, is so shocking, so jarring, that one would hope that people will remember. And I think that's a part of our duty in this time. Our first duty is to keep ourselves. Our second duty is to survive this economic crash and to make sure that our communities do the same. Our third duty is to protect democracy and to make sure that our civic and democratic life survives so that when this is done, we can elect leaders who will care for us. But our fourth duty, I believe, related to that third one, is to take names, to remember who let us down, who exploited us in this time, and to hold them to account. And I can tell you, I, as a writer and a commentator, am gonna do that. I am not going to forget what the state Supreme Court, what the U.S. Supreme Court, and what these legislators did. It is unconscionable to ask grandmothers on the north side of Milwaukee to get up before dawn and to get on a bus and to ride through the city for to wait in line for hours to cast a ballot amidst the pandemic.
John, before I let you go, one thing that I've been reading about has been, and this is a phenomenon that's not just happening in Milwaukee, it's happening in Louisiana, I believe. I think it's happening in Detroit. We obviously don't have a full set of data on these on this, but ProPublica has a piece about early data that shows that almost half of Milwaukee's counties, almost 1,000 cases, and 81% of its 27 deaths in a county are African Americans. And this is a population, the population is 26% Black. Do you have a sense of what accounts for that?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of things, and I'm not a public health expert, so I'll put that up front. But we have seen an underfunding of Milwaukee and of Milwaukee County in recent years by the state, certainly during the Walker years. Though Scott Walker, our former governor, was from Milwaukee County, he regularly attacked it and was very, very critical of it. We have seen an underfunding of our healthcare system in Wisconsin that is extreme. It has undermined elements of our healthcare system. This is a state where the Republicans refused to cooperate with the Affordable Care Act, refused to take the Medicare, Medicaid money that they could. Now the governor, our current governor, the Democratic governor, has done a lot in the last year to try and fill that void. But you had the better part of 10 years of underfunding and neglect. And I think that in combination with systemic racism and all of the issues that extend from that, especially in urban areas and especially in Milwaukee, have created a situation where something very horrific is happening. And that is that this disease is being concentrated in certain communities. The same thing is happening in Chicago, by the way, and in some other cities. We don't know the full play out of it, but the fact of the matter is the evidence that ProPublica and others. Hello. And it also, frankly, it relates back to the issues that we're talking about, because if indeed we have a city, Milwaukee, where you have a large number of African Americans who have tested positive, and too large number who have already died. The idea that you would reduce the number of polling places, people to move about at significant levels and wait in line for hours it's a particularly awful choice made by our politicians at this time.
John Nichols, I know you have a new article up, an interview with Bernie Sanders specifically about the coronavirus. It's at The Nation magazine. I've yet to read it, but that's literally on my list of things to do immediately after the show today. Appreciate your taking the time today, and hang in there and stay safe.
I will do that. I hope you will do the same, and I hope all your listeners do the same as well. Thanks for focusing on these important issues.
All right, John Nichols. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. All right, folks, we're going to head into the fun half of the program.